Oh yeah. Da tsema chungba gone ani tyoba telo goba kari yores. Takazanga zu dishe yorwa.
What we were doing yesterday was an explanation of the purpose of praising him by how he came to be infallible.
Yeah. Da di tsema ke chungbu yimbi gyumzendi kazan robzi sheshen barwa.
So yesterday, the importance of pramana, valid cognition, we briefly touched upon.
Da namba zu dus gongba shen na gore. Ngaran sugi da topja di ani ni nangla dyurugre. Topja di ni nangla dyurugre. Chigdela karsigre ngonto chigdela ngele. Ngonto yu koban ta ngele yu koban sin ta ngazu topja di ni dire.
So you can also kind of consider it in this way. Whatever one wishes to attain, one's resultant attainment will be one of two kinds. I think in English it's called high status or higher births, and definitive goodness or definite goodness it's called, I think.
Dale tangbo dusan digdwa. Tangbo dela chöba dan jigden ba siji yewani che.
So here again, before that, you can make a distinction, or you can distinguish between someone who practices, so a practitioner, and a worldly person.
Oh yeah. Da jigden ba da chöba se di jigden ba le yewa di sam kawani che gore slabdu oda nyungtala matala tobja ngontola samlo tangje nyamlen che ringe dela ani chöba se gorta.
So when you call someone a practitioner, like the distinguishing feature, the minimum, like the first distinguishing feature between a worldly person and a practitioner is that the minimum goal that a practitioner works for is, I think it's called higher birth, but high status is how it's translated in some texts.
Oh yeah. Da gyawa chima la gyawa chima penje gi geje de mebache. Gyawa chima penje geje de mebache. Tse de garangi ni dedugla samo mado ni di mede gen tela ngadu namju jigden ba ase gore.
Someone who doesn't have any thought of subsequent births but is only concerned with results in this birth, that's what is referred to here as a worldly person.
Oh yeah. So ta tela ko kharse gore. Ta dindegi midi se digi didung modu samno koya medinge midi la ya samba sangbo yo chogre. Samba sangbo yo chogre. Ani chig mile jimba tanya la lagwa shangbo yo chogre. Dene ya chigi sögom yo chogre. Migi kongdul langba yine söba gom ya dine sögom yabu yo chogre. Kari ne yo chogre de kanda korangi miyu di nanglo la gyawa chima penje seyagi miyu nanglo di malib chenje la kola nga du jigden pa asikri.
Such a person who's only concerned with trying to be free of suffering and find ways to be happy in this life itself doesn't mean that they have to be necessarily unkind or bad. In fact, they can be very kind, they can be very generous, they can be very philanthropic, they can be very patient, they can be very understanding. And so that they necessarily have to be ill-willed or ill-intentioned is not the case. And they can do all of these things. One can be doing and engaging in all of these actions. But if the goal in one's life or one's aim is limited to trying to attain a state of well-being in this life, then that person is called a worldly person.
Oh yeah. Ta miyu di chima penche seji semnalo miyu di shadinge kansa tela ta nga zo chöbas labita. Chöbas.
When the aim is beyond just this birth, but also is for subsequent births, then that means that person is what here, when we refer to the term practitioner, that's what the term refers to, that they're considering their intention is something beyond just this birth.
다 조 라랭기 차니 미디 셈바시라 상고메고 용식이래 양 세나 차오치는 진바 땅마토와 용식이래 양 룽랑 초주 서버 고마토와 용초그래 라랭기 차니 고 눈주 미튼쇼 망보 단기기 직된바틀이 껴와 용초그래 돼 이내 코랑기 삼로 딩 나로라 미유디 세딜 치마 개체와 세기 미유디 레친젤라 코 쳐바차로 그래 직된바차기 말해
Such a person who is a practitioner, because their concerns are not limited just to this life, they may actually be less kind or less patient or less generous, more stingy, more angry compared to that other person who is a worldly person. So in terms of their behavior and in terms of their actions, they may actually come across, or they may be less nice, less kind, less thoughtful. But if in their deep down inside their concerns extend beyond this birth, then irrespective of what their actions are, that wish would make them, is what makes them a practitioner as opposed to an ordinary person.
Oh yeah, dilabdu chöbada jidimba nyigi kebardi karigani cheso.
So in this case, what differentiates a practitioner from a worldly person?
미유기 차네.
In terms of their objective.
그래서 미유기 차네. 미유텔라 디심마투 친젤라 퀄리티 샴바의 가리 약부 연나야 콜라 지딘바스 라오마도 쳐바시 말해.
So irrespective of how good their qualities are or how good they might be, based on one's kind of aims or one's objective, that's what differentiates between worldly versus practitioner.
그래서 어디시디 쳐봐도 지딘바스에 미유가니 깨져셔서 어디시 디캠버 쳐버려. 다 된대기 치모 편지 삼로 땅댕에 될라 다 쳐봐 나로라 다 가리요레스는 쳐봐 나로라 릭니 제제 아니 원도 좀미 톱자라 송체 미유심댕에 대당 아니 원도 좀 마임바 녜렉 아니 미유로 심댕에 다 릭니 차로 다 쳐들라 최칭에게 미유텔라다 미유 나로라 니 차로.
Then when you've distinguished between practitioners and worldly people, and therefore worldly, those objectives, within the objectives of a practitioner there can still be two. One is this one which we call high status, but it basically means a superior birth or a higher birth, because their objective is the next one onwards. And so that's one objective. The other objective is what is called definitive goodness.
다디인도 덴데기 온도 좀 된도 녜딩에기 미유를 샤딩에 덴데 강사텔라 간조 기부충우시고래.
The person or when one's aim is a higher status or a higher birth, such a person is, in the terminology that you find, is referred to as a person with inferior capacity or small capacity.
야 당기 나신 찍어체 딘디기 미데라 셈바 상보다 진바 당양 가보다 딜 심바 딱 캐주 심바 가리면 가리 여바 있나야 고랑이 미유디 나로라 원토세 대점마도 레마토나 꾸기부 충무자들.
And like we said before, they might be excellent, kind, good, very ethical, very patient. They might have all of these qualities, but if their objective is a higher birth or higher birth, then they still are someone of small capacity.
다 텔레도데 아니 미위디 온토 좀 마임바 타르바고도 스타 풍부 동에 텔레 타르고도 세제 타르바 미유를 샤딩에 강사디기 야 조와라랭기 차네 당게딜레 또 껴와 연나야 제단데도 또 껴와 연나야 코랑기 푸기 미유디 나로는 티심딩에 강사디나 데네 강사디 기부딩 차.
And then again, similarly, if in terms of how they behave, someone who wishes to attain liberation, and so their goal is to attain a state free of these aggregates, if that's their aim is liberation, and compared to someone who only wishes for a higher birth, the person who wishes for liberation, their behavior is worse, less kind, less patient, less thoughtful, less considerate. All of that, it still does not change the fact that they are beings of middling capacity, because this is decided by one's goal. So if the goal is liberation, even if in terms of how they act or their conduct, they might seem inferior to the person of lower capacity who is very well behaved, they still are beings of middling scope or middling capacity.
다 디나 신셰제 다양 미유디 타바섬 마임바셰 아니 미유디 탐지신배 고방세 상계유 고방세 디미유를 샤소나 아니 기부디 기부 첨부 차도리.
And then if the goal now is not just liberation, but one's goal then goes beyond and becomes attaining a state of Buddhahood or omniscience, then that person is higher scope.
딜랍드다 직된반에 기부충무니 기부딩니 기부충보세 디 차상디 이와 체사디 개버 체사 쪼우디 가리가니 체기래 미유기가니 체로.
So the distinction here that they make, which is from worldly to small scope, middle scope, and high scope, is all based on the objective of each one of these people. Based on their objective, then one falls within one of these categories or not.
다 미유 가가 여바인데 미유 가가 여바인데 대두지게 람대야 다 람딜라야 고 민다베 개발레는 거라 람사브사브도 그러와.
And because the goal of each one of these is different, the path to attain that result or that goal is also going to be progressively subtler and subtler and subtler.
그래. 소자 땅 온토섬 미유 샤딩에 온토섬 미유 샤딩에 미유티 다 기부 중무서고라 기부 중무기 미유티 톱제게 람다 디나로네 람 쪼부다부디 추짐체 아니 쇼르라 짐바도 쇠바이디체.
So the one whose aim is a favorable birth, their main practice becomes ethical conduct, and as side practices they would engage in generosity and patience, but their main practice then becomes the practice of ethics.
Oh yeah. 다 디간라 태고침부스도 기부 딩기 미유 숨딩에 강사되게 아니 기부 딩기 미유 숨딩에 강사되게다 냠낸 쪼부다부디 딘심메다 수슈도디.
And the one with middling scope, their main practice is understanding and cultivating an realization of the four truths and the 16 aspects of the four truths.
다 태고침부간의 내용도 아니 간소 태고침부간의 내용도 미유 당 톱자 대가란 채다 톱제기 람텔라 다 장주기 셈 닝지 첨부 다 장바다 닝지 쪼 체디게 아니 진소 퍼진 두 차상와 다 딩냠네 쪼 체디게 그래.
When you talk about high scope, then their primary practice becomes the perfections, which are the perfections such as generosity, ethics, patience, etc.
다디 인도 진소 퍼진 tukse di nanglo la tene 퍼진 당부 숨지도와 퍼진 당부 숨디 조 몬토 주베기 쳐드리 진바 수림 쇠바 숨보도 조 몬토 주베기 쳐리.
So when you talk of these six perfections, how do we say them in English? Generosity, ethics, is it? Ethics. One second. Generosity, ethics, patience, endurance. Is that what it is? Perseverance? Joyous perseverance. Okay. Then there's concentration and wisdom. These six. Of these six, the first three, which are ethics, generosity, ethics, and patience or forbearance, their primary role is to give a result of higher status or of a favorable birth.
다 퍼진 타만이데 쌈데데 셔럽니부디 퍼진 타만이데 so nyelek drubegi chudre.
The last two, which are concentration and wisdom, their main aim, or like their main result, why they cultivate it, is to attain what is called, do you know what definitive goodness is? Yeah? Definitive goodness is another way of talking about either liberation or Buddhahood. When you separate high status from definitive goodness, high status is a favorable birth. Definitive goodness is when the objective is either Buddhahood or liberation.
다 탐지심배 고방두벨라 니차상으로 냠내 지기요.
And so for someone who wants to attain Buddhahood, then they practice all of these.
뭐야? 디치르다 파진 죽디 준주 투몽기 교래.
And this perseverance is common to both.
오야. 다 디치드 디딕소아. 다 톱자 수수수제 안 톱제기 람디체 디차소아. 다 단다 딘디기 줍정운토다 녜링이 요바인투 다 운토디 줍베기 추송부티 냠린 제야라 다 디냠린디 가장 아주 셰번나싱 단다 체마디 구구르베 슬라바이나 딘디기 체마디 메베 토네 제바 체마디 메베 토네 이제기 토네 냠린 제야 융투구르스나 융투구르.
So if you separate the three goals, and now you see which one of the perfections are causes that support which goal, the first three, which are causes that are the main causes for a better birth or for a favorable birth, what we were discussing yesterday is to cultivate which path do you need valid cognition, do you need pramana? For someone who wishes to cultivate a path that leads to a favorable birth, do they need to have valid cognition of the path, or can they pursue that path and attain the result solely through faith and belief? And so if one asks this question, the answer to that is yes. For someone who's only concerned with a favorable birth, the path that they cultivate doesn't require that they ascertain that path through valid cognition. It's enough if they have faith and believe in it and engage in it, it will lead to that result.
gomboludug umar njetiwa nalola ngondogi chodo ngelegi chuni sonje tinyigida dubjigi gyuzo de la tebade sheramni so tebade ngondo dugire sherabdigi ngele dugires odisonre.
So in Arya Nagarjuna's precious garland, the content of this text is divided into high status and definitive goodness. And he says the causes for high status or higher birth are faith, and the causes for definitive goodness are wisdom. So he separates the causes for these two.
다 체메 장배 개왕같이 체메 녜베 토네 개왕같이 체메 녜바다 되네 렌데기 남샤 송샤바 된조라 체메 녜바 유베 토네 이시여나 푸숨 소베 양아체 지피세 게데 체메 장배 녜시에 게 매바 있나야 타지도 아니 이시시 송럽이 제수 장네 강사기 제수 장지 나간도 룽기 제수 장네 타지도 이시체제 jimba tsudim soba sungu nyamne che thugure.
And so for this person whose aim is to attain a favorable birth, they may engage in practicing or cultivating the causes for a higher birth after having ascertained that there is rebirth. But even if they have not ascertained that there is rebirth, by trusting or by having faith in the teachings that teach the causes that are required to cultivate, that are required to bring about a higher birth, when someone of small capacity wishes to attain higher status or a higher birth, when they just follow what is said in the texts purely through faith, even if they haven't ascertained that there is rebirth with valid cognition, they can cultivate that path and they also attain that result, purely based on faith.
jaba tsema mebache, jaba chimo tobe tsema mebache, inaya tajigdo ishigi tone, nyamne chedingi peya gudindu tonya yorda.
And there are many people who, even currently to this day, we see who, without having ascertained that there are future lives, engage in this sort of practice, and they do a really good job of it, and they're also very good, virtuous people. We see that.
Diche. Ta di sangye bichugi ta nyamne nanglo ta keja shedi libgo orbesa na di sangye bichugi nyamne che nanglo keja shigo mari.
So then, is this practice that one is doing, if this person is a practitioner, then this practice that they're doing, does this belong to the category of practices that were taught by the Buddha or practices of the Buddha Dharma? And this practice itself does not belong to the category of practicing the Buddha Dharma.
Karjin lana ta di shembatsu, chulu shembatsu gen, nyamne thagaran chetugu yore, miyu thagaran simana she, miyu thagaran ki lam takta nyamne che ne, untu dumne do tugu yore.
The reason why it doesn't belong to belongs to the practices of the Buddha Dharma is because it's a practice that many non-Buddhists also do. And so cultivating the causes for a favorable birth and attaining favorable births is a practice that is common to many traditions and not unique to the Buddhist tradition. And so if that is one's main practice, that does not still belong to practicing the Buddha Dharma. That's still not practicing the Dharma.
다 상계 비추기 냠네 세디 가wan 고추그레스 람나 타르바데 테네 타르바 미유레 샤네 대토제기 람다 제베 토네 아니 상계 비추기 냠네 무시 디니 고추기요다.
So then when the Buddha taught practices that were taught by the Buddha that lead to the results that the Buddha spoke of, so what qualifies as Buddhist practice, the starting point, the basic beginning of Buddhist practices in relation to liberation. So when a practice one's practice is aimed at attaining liberation, then that becomes the first kind of stepping stone amongst the practices that are considered Buddhist practices.
다 타르발라 이시셰네. 다 타르발라 이시셰네. 다 타르바 미유리샤. 타르바 체메 텔라 마파바지. 타바 요레 산 이시셰네. 대토제기 람 냠네 체오르와. 람 냠네 체오르와. 소자 다 타르바 미유레샤네. 타바 요레 산 타지도 이시셰네. 짐바 땅 조그레. 수림송 조그레. 쇠바 곰 조그레. 지직비 띵니지요 곰 조그레. 그러와? 따이네 셰럽 곰 투그레 베스나. 셰럽 곰 투그 말해.
So if then one's aim is liberation and one has not ascertained that liberation exists, so again now we talk about the pramana part of it, if one does not have valid cognition that liberation exists and one has faith in the fact that it does or one trusts that it does without knowing that it exists, without having realized that it exists, one can engage in practices such as generosity, ethical behavior, patience, forbearance, perseverance, and even single-pointed concentration. But what one cannot cultivate, unless one has ascertained liberation exists or not, is wisdom. So the practice of wisdom is absent if someone is trying to attain liberation without knowing that it exists.
다 타르바 요레 삼시 이시디기 토네 셰럽 곰구디 아니 셰럽 곰에디 다 딘데 요 말해 베나 다메도 비 셰럽 곰고르와 다메도 비 셰럽 곰군디 아니 최담제 다메이 도 삼데바이나 디 다메도 비 셰럽 곰 고추기 요 말해.
So when you say one is cultivating the wisdom of selflessness, the way that one cultivates the wisdom of selflessness, or if one says all phenomena lack self, or there is no self, and then one just cultivates this thought, that does not qualify as cultivating the wisdom of selflessness. That's not the wisdom of selflessness.
디레 소자다 셰럽 곰단디 ni tönam gomedire mato shenam gomedi mare kasada tönam jindang yuji yorwa jindang yugi shinyu di kan gomere mato shinyu di magaba sheche shinyu di rigbe kama to bashe ani tete yi samba digi sherab gomba gomnal dugu yo mare.
Because when you say one is cultivating wisdom, the way one cultivates wisdom is by understanding the object, that is its mode of apprehension. So it is gaining clarity in its object, that is its object of mode of apprehension. And so by refuting the object of self-grasping and getting clarity on the object that it is meditating or it is cultivating, that's how one cultivates wisdom. Wisdom is not cultivated by strengthening the thought or the way of apprehending it. It's the object that is central to the cultivation of wisdom, not the mind that is thinking of that object. And so you're strengthening and clarifying the aspect of the object, not the aspect or the action that the mind is doing when you're talking about wisdom.
Ta di indu kangla ngelek thobje di sherabre. Tanda di rinjin chiwa nanglo la. Undu ngelek chue ni songche di ruba dorduna dona teda sherabos. Teje ni je chue la ten sherab den che yangda riks. Soza undu ki chue la ngelek chue ni nanglo du rugu yodi di rubje di dorduna teba da sherab ni res. Ta teba yunge digi undu rubtu gure sherab yunge digi ngele rubtu gure. Gyumzen kharshin lana sherab digi ani nilug rigi res. Odi songdoa.
So in the Precious Garland, Arya Nagarjuna says, the causes for high status and definitive goodness are faith and wisdom. Faith leads to higher status. Wisdom realizes its object. And so wisdom being the cause for definitive goodness, Arya Nagarjuna explains, is because wisdom is what knows its object.
Oh, dire. Soza ta di indu sherab la maden bar ani ngele dup thugu mare ngele gi lam la to shuk thugu mare ngele gi lam khoron la shuk thugu mare ta shuk ma to na lam thini ne ya khoma la dre di thege jan yung marwa lam khoron la shuk thugu me na.
So without wisdom, one can not only not attain the result that is definitive goodness, but one cannot get on the path. So if one can't get on the path, or one doesn't have access to the path, then clearly one also does not, can't really attain the result of that path, which is definitive goodness.
Ta sangye bi chue nyamne said otirda.
So when one speaks of Buddhist practice, this is the minimum requirement. I mean, this is the basic requirement for it to qualify.
So ta sangye bi chue nyamne jingi jigi miyu khari kore miyu de la ngele. Reso dubje lam di khandej gore sherab zo uche de korda.
So if one is practicing or one is trying to cultivate a Buddhist path, then the objective or the goal has to be definitive goodness, and the path that one is cultivating has to be centered around wisdom primarily.
What? Tichidu ta tembesheje duba zamling de la penche chusunga pe yongdu chusunga pe korang de chusunga pe di zo di nyele gi chusunga pe mado ngundu gi chusunga zo pe mare.
So the reason why Shakyamuni Buddha came amongst us was to primarily teach the means or the methods to attain definitive goodness. His main teaching is not centered around attaining a favorable birth. But that does not mean that he didn't teach many methods or many techniques to attain favorable status as well. And even though he did teach paths that lead to favorable births, the objective of him teaching these paths was eventually to bring those paths steer them in the direction of attaining liberation, or definitive goodness, sorry.
lurinibege lusendi tanda di shen di ngazu gi miure di ya washen bala rilam de mena di physi chetu gu meba yende dure de lapro o tina shiri.
It's kind of like the same reason why last year we taught Duja, or the reason all of you were studying Duja last year the purpose wasn't for you to know Duja. The purpose was so that you can learn Duja and learn how to reason, so that then in the second year you can use that as a method to gain access to the meaning of this year. Because without understanding how to reason, you will not be able to understand what is being taught this year. And so it was done with that intention, to be able to study this year. It wasn't done to just learn Duja itself.
Kiranzo tarba raturo chenas, nilegi chede raturo chenas, tamjishimbe chede raturo chenas, o dichedo ani dudalab gorwa, dinashin sheji jumdindi ngundu gi chu sungu yorde, inaya chu sungba digi miyu shaksa pukdi karire, nilegi tiye chedo ani du sungu yore.
So the aim was to make you all have an idea, or at least try and find some way for all of you to be aware that liberation exists, what it is, and how it's attainable. And so that's kind of the same reason that when the Buddha also taught the various paths or techniques or the causes for higher birth or favorable births, he didn't teach that as a final goal, but as a means to eventually attain definitive goodness.
So the day in the Jumdindi Chu, Minda, Dujaki come to Tunji Chu, Minda song deba yendu, and Dojik Nalola. Jumdendegeta, Dujal Chuswing, Muzo Karina Asia, the Dodinalo Gijaleyundu, Nimuzo di Dujadi, Nilegi Kovan Tiatis. What is one?
So, in the different sutras, the Buddha giving different teachings based on the kind of audience he had and the various requirements of the people. Because he gave so many different teachings, there's one sutra where the Buddha is asked, what's the goal of all of the teachings of the Buddha? And the Buddha says, the goal of my teachings is to lead people to definitive goodness.
So that Donald Tisson Yoba Indu, T. Gumzela Tenche, and Jerumshege, Tindu Nalola. Kugi Chini Kazava, Tindi Nile, Zamtijo. Tang Yangi Deshirde, Shigur Minze, Kula means.
Which is why in the Praise to Dependent Arising, Lama Tsongkhapa, he says, whatever you have taught was taught with the intention of, or keeping in mind, dependent arising, and that too is for the purpose of attaining liberation. Therefore, there is nothing that you have taught that is not a path to peace, or to peace.
So that Gundigi Chuma Son Yundi, Ani Kiwachima Son the Tariada, Kiwachima, Ani Dendrola Tobe, Dindi Gundigi, Dinjungi Chede, Ma Sungi Yorate, in a Son Yundi, Chiedi, that did Tangilavanashe. They are Yangi Deshedes, Dujeti, Yangdegi Sala Tieg Mishani, the Sungi Yores.
So when the Buddha taught or teaches about causality, the causes that lead to effects, how certain causes lead to favorable births, this entire presentation of causality that the Buddha does is like Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, even though he's talking about causality, which is a form of dependent arising, the intention of teaching this is eventually for the purpose of liberation.
Oh yeah. That digi karita chores lana. Semala matembar. Semala mateba ni kazangi nyamlin che yomare zikeje shedi di sangi bichugi nyamlin che di keje shedi da. Tanda di nyelegi chole zambe nyamlin che di ragmare so di shedi da.
So what we were saying yesterday, which is without valid cognition you can't practice, or one can't practice anything without valid cognition, without pramana, was in this sense that to practice what the Buddha said, that practice has to be aimed at definitive goodness, and for a practice to be cultivating definitive goodness without having valid cognition, one cannot practice a path that leads to definitive goodness. So without having valid cognition, one cannot practice the teachings of the Buddha. That's what I meant when I said this yesterday.
dire so da dinshi mida su juru tseme mado ba cheche dinshi mida su juru de mida ba yin de te yin samba digi dinshi mida su juru nyamne kochog ma ba da di ngadu nyego ha ko.
So what we need to be sure of and what we need to be absolutely certain in is that to cultivate or to practice a path or to practice the teachings of the Four Truths and the 16 aspects without valid cognition, we are not practicing them. So just saying or repeating to ourselves that things are impermanent, or just repeating to ourselves or believing that things lack a self or that there is no self and not ascertaining it is not really a path that is practicing the Four Truths.
Ta pena ngondo thundu nyedingi khansa chigla ta so jeba yina nyesongi gyures di yindu da kera ngondo yewa chimo ngondo koban togo na so je yo mares so jeba yina nyesongi gibi gyures lana ani ko di tseme changbe sherab ke meba yina tseme gi ngishi ke meba yina ya yishi ge tone o ta 드리는 손데 이 소지기면 소제바 남투도 와 드리는 이 소지기면 담자체바는 디기 소제 담에 펜토도.
For instance, if someone says killing is the cause of a lower birth and therefore abstain from killing, when you hear that, just believing in those words and believing that killing will lead to a lower birth is enough for someone to be able to abstain from killing and take a vow or make a promise that from this day onwards I will not kill. So to be able to take that vow or have that restraint doesn't require any realization. Just hearing the words and believing them is sufficient to engage in that practice.
다 타르바 주발라 단징기 규칙이 요래 소자 단징기 코갈라 팽기래 안 타바토거나 담에 곰고래서나 야다 드리니 손내가 담에 곰기 최던제 담에 슬랍되나 당기 대신 남린 딱다 죽으면도 와 당진 도 죽으면도 와.
Similarly, if one says self-grasping is the cause of suffering, to remove self-grasping you need to realize selflessness, and then realizing selflessness is the cause for liberation. If one hears that and says, okay, from this day onwards I am going to meditate on selflessness, and then you say everything is selfless, there is no self, and you sustain that, it's not a practice that is cultivating selflessness, because it's cultivating selflessness cannot be done in the same way that one abstains from actions such as killing. There's a difference in these two kind of practicing.
So nga sin이라서 주 로탕고니 제제 파기 타마 sin이라서 마트면 봐도 이 최담제 담에서 가져를 라비어.
So in my own case, from the first day I joined IBD till the end of it, how many times have I said all phenomena are selfless, all phenomena are empty? How many times would I have said that?
라와 좀 넘어서 가져줘요. 담에 이미 두제 가져신줘요.
Not just that, how many times have I debated it? How many times have I tried to prove that it doesn't exist? How many times have I used reasoning to show that it's not existent, it's not possible that there is a self?
So that 담에레 라데바디 펜루고 요나다 딱 살로주루 담에레 라데로 펜고로와. 뒷마 펜고 세고 슈 하고도와 용외토네.
If constantly repeating to oneself that everything lacks a self was an effective way of going about doing it, for 16 years I must have said it every single day, hundreds of times, there definitely should have been some outcome or some benefit. But after 16 years there wasn't any benefit just because of saying that.
담에 라데바디기 dos tempa samgi pen rugu yoba ina ani nganzo mantra gyore sal dame gyo shen tigra chedamje dame bum bum sa shen tigra
And
paji
then,
dawa ching nanglo bum sum sa to gshi.
and also if it was sufficient to say everything is selfless, then instead of reciting all of these complicated mantras, one could just sit there and say everything is selfless, and you could probably accumulate 300,000 of them in a month.
라 다와진의 붐숨 껴려나 딱 단지 가지 충으로 얘기해.
And if in a month you could have recited 300,000 times that everything is selfless, how much smaller or less intense should self-grasping have become?
이는 용의 거리 카타기도 단지 강리 치워진 대도라자.
But if you look at your own kind of how you are, how one's experience is, it stays exactly the same. It doesn't reduce even remotely.
다동 디간다 시자윤데 나르마시바 망아지 셰유데 나지 텔레체오 단지 텔레체오 단지 느비게기도 귤라 나랑 용할 까네 디통한데.
And so, for instance, in my own case, leave aside that self-grasping doesn't reduce, but the more things you know, the more things you learn, the more information you acquire, all of these become further kind of accolades that I collect and we collect to further make our self-grasping even more strong and even more kind of solid and concrete.
디시디 가리 타체소나나 셰럽 계단디 당긴낭시 멤버디. 그래서 셰럽 계단디 딘데시니 끼기 메와디 하고고다.
So what this makes absolutely clear is that cultivating wisdom is not like that earlier other way of cultivating an ethical behavior or ethical conduct. And so this is absolutely clear that wisdom, or practicing wisdom, is not like practicing ethics. It's different.
So that 셰럽디 게라 가레고레 응연라 통고 타진징이 로도까 그래. 타진징이 로도까 발라 타진징이 로도 고제기 탑람델라 턴주 양다기 남샤. 데니 두브자기 체마 고 두브자기 체마 두브자기 탑람델라 딘지 양다. 소자 턴주 양다다 다양다 텔라 때니 다 셰럽디 게고르마도 셴바 셰럽게 탑람 가야 메르다.
So to cultivate wisdom the way that it has been done and the way it's done is to first remove that absolute certainty in the opposite of what wisdom is. So in that single-pointed absolute certainty that there is a self, the first step is to kind of pierce a hole in this armor. And that is done by understanding the consequences or by using consequences to show contradictions in a certain belief. That itself requires some amount of thinking and reflection and reasoning. And then after that, after having broken that single-pointed conviction that there is a self, to give rise to the realization that there is no self, one needs reasons to generate that inference.
운동이 주변이 체마도 운동이 주변이 바로라 제와디 하고 같이 다 된대기 체마디 당보 때나 방에디 제바 체마마도 로사 매바인데 아니 제바 체마 이 돈에 무슨 제바 체마도 공부하는 무슨 체마 끼고 여바인데 대목 무슨 돈으로 끼고 여바인데 어느 제바 체마 끼고야 제바 체마 끼에기 탑람들라 따ян다마도 매바 그래서 이 인도 타진징으로도 세월라 탄주양다마도 매바 다디 남샤디 셴바이나 지글럼 세야디 다 단다 턴주양다다 다양다 꿰데 타진징이 로도 세당이 리과데다 두저두제기 꿰데 리과데라 지글럼 세고르다 다 지글럼디 카가스기 nen가 쳔바이메디 어떠드니 셰르다.
So if you understand this, then you also understand the connection between inference and how central it is in attaining definitive goodness. How it is the access to the path to attain definitive goodness. And if you understand this, then you also understand that for having inference, which is the only way that one can start, it's indispensable that one understands what a reason is, or what an accurate or correct reason is. And so without having an understanding of how reasoning works, or how reasons work in generating inference, one does not understand inference. And so if you understand the importance of inferences, it will naturally lead to understand the importance of reasons. And this whole presentation of what makes a reason accurate or correct, what makes a consequence correct, is what we mean when we say learning how to reason, or the path of reasoning. So being able to use consequences to break single-pointed belief, and then being able to use reasons or proof statements to establish a thesis, is being familiar and well-versed in these methods, is what it means when we say one learns the path of reasoning or one learns how to reason. And so then, if you've understood this entire way of how to cultivate definitive goodness, the centrality or the essential nature of understanding how to reason or cultivate a path of reasoning becomes clear.
다양 점마 기세 세리야게슈 체인제 아니 다면 통토에 양셰된도 쇠톤 투자 쇠톤나 디니문에는 아주 디 공부시 줘.
If in the future scientific progress is able to make some sort of instrument that can directly perceive selflessness or gives us direct access to selflessness, then from that day onwards we can say we don't require these texts anymore, we can put them aside.
But
until such a day that we don't really have much of a choice. It's things like this that show us how to go about.
Oh, that Gumzen tell a danger, Lobin Shoga Lambogi, some of you were dollar pensheba, say Georgia Saboshu, Chujagan, Deba Puji, Dinima Shumuji Sangma, Dindigan will shed it, Jabasema, Dianda, Dindigan will shed it.
Which is why Acharya Dignaga in his Compendium of Valid Cognition, after giving this kind of very succinct but meaning-laden homage verse, when then he actually goes on to compose the text, the only thing he's discussing in the text is what a correct reason is, what a false reason is, what correct inference is, how to generate inference, how do you use consequences. The entire text, after giving this extremely meaningful homage, only discusses the means of acquiring valid knowledge.
Do
you understand now why it makes sense that after having this kind of homage, why then the entire text is solely concerned with explaining the means for valid cognition? Do you feel that? Do you feel that? The reason why I'm asking you is because in the past, not many people felt that this was important. Which is why many people, when they see Acharya Dignaga's Pramanavartika Ch, this text, they often feel that this has no utility in practice, this is not relevant for practice. So not only in the past, but even in today, we see many people who say, oh yeah, these texts on reasoning and logic and pramana, they're not relevant for someone who's concerned with practice. They have no role in practice. It's a very common attitude, very, very common.
Including me first year in ARPD. Kazi dung sheba na sheba. Di dawa shinga dawa tools nga that to the tola chamber di hamagoji. Di nenga matonch, nenga mashebaji. Hamagoji. The lamia mararwa. Kasor, the machine matonerwa.
I think I told you the way I kind of started out in IBD, where for the first 4 months, I didn't see the benefit of this at all. So I kept trying to, I didn't see the utility of debate. I thought it was some kind of futile mental exercise.
Oh, dear. That Jaranzo, the Nenga di, Lubin Shogalambo, Temata, Georgia Sama Digana Shed, Nenga Tondi, Pentrajista.
That's why if you have been able to see why someone like Acharya Dignaga, after having this incredible homage, he spends the remaining entire text solely concerned with explaining the means for acquiring valid cognition, with reasons, what makes a correct reason, what is the definition of a reason, what are the 3 modes, etc. If you see why, after such a homage, this is the only thing he talks about, and you see some benefit in it, that in itself is very, very good. It's very noteworthy. Please bear that in mind.
Chema de dunes, debasa dunes amyorda. Luta with danger sum, Yanata with danger shishi, sat danger dunes am, Pandechuragi.
So then if you also further think about the fact that this single text by Acharya Dignaga, when Acharya Dharmakirti decided to explain it, he wrote 7 commentaries on one single text. They're called the 3 commentaries that are like the body, and then there's 4 commentaries that are like the limbs. But for one single text, Acharya Dharmakirti, to explain it, he wrote 7 commentaries.
So the dedication movement sata dinje 단어버더라 딘지 찍라 로병 코로나랑이 제바 엔데사 딘데만 우쌈샤바 딘데 하람 중요해요 말해.
Think about it though, right? If this wasn't an important text, why would someone like Dharmakirti have to write 7 commentaries to one text? There is no other text where one single text has had a commentator who's written 7 commentaries on one text. There isn't.
So that 제바 딘디 맞am나 데바칸요 말다 디체 딘지 디게 제자 딱다지 다도 대시야 통소서 데바마칸이 제유로다.
He must have written 7 because he wasn't satisfied that 1 or 2 were enough in being able to completely comment or explain the whole thing. No, otherwise, why would he write 7? It's true. This is the only text that has this kind of commentaries that have been written to it by one, but there isn't another text like this. And of these 7 texts, the one which is, so of the 3 that are like the body, which means they are a complete commentary on the whole text. That's what's like the body. The most extensive one is the Pramanavartika, which we're doing the 2nd chapter of. And it's really vast, the way he explains this whole thing. And as a tradition that started off this entire commentarial tradition of Pramana, if you look at the number of commentaries that came up as commentaries to the Pramanavartika after Acharya Dharmakirti, you'll see that there's enormous amounts of commentaries. There's so many that even if you wished in your life to read all of them, you won't be able to. There's actually that much literature on just the Pramanavartika.
슝이 내가 하마고 나야 도가지도 사기도 아껴 내가 가려요나 시 된데 간데스 대시기하는 배도 그런 쇼 대바 삼고 내가 된데지면 로벤도 대가 쌈쌈지던데 이지 말고다.
So even if you don't understand the meaning of the content of the text, a little bit of a doubt one should have, no, by saying, why in God's name would so many people spend so much time and energy writing infinite amounts of commentaries on this one single text? They wouldn't just be wasting their time or whiling away time doing something, considering who they were. So the fact that all of them have spent so much time writing so many commentaries on this should suggest that there is some worth to it, or there is something useful that is needed in these texts. Which is why when you sit and you're learning how to reason and debate, you might feel like you're wasting time. But even that 1 second that you think you're wasting it because you're not practicing is actually extremely helpful when it ties into all of this, because this is the final goal. So you're not wasting even a single second by standing outside and clapping and debating.
단다 투제세나 가서 미 깨와 요백합도 투제들로 가질라나 가서 밀을 직바요라 투모마인바디 미 류된데기 토네 가서 투모마인바디 가리열라나 남식이 땡체 부숨 소바디요 와.
And the time that you have to learn how to reason is when you're humans, because that's when you have the ability to reason. When you're not in a human state, you don't have the ability. So to cultivate this skill is now when you have this state. We can see the animals don't have it, right? We might feel like the devas, they might have this, but they don't. They just have a lot of these clairvoyant states. They don't have the ability to cultivate reasoning. Only humans have this skill. So, which is why, whether we like it or not, you have to learn it.
So the that dendegi riglam chanche miyu ngelek dende ngelek da tedan de chue chi tenla phabe gi du lam jang ji dende che da di cheme tenla phaba ji top gorwa di top sona ani chini nangwa sangge bi chue nyamle ngune da che gor gozuru do da dende di cheme ngi shenye ba ji ma chung gi par to ta khari che gores.
So if that's how it is, then to be able to get on this path or get on this way, one has to learn this skill. And after learning the skill, then one has to ascertain whatever one has to ascertain, and then that's going to lead on to practicing or cultivating this path. And so until one can do that, what does one do?
Labi yondu ani gumbuludugi umarin jentiwa nanglola. Soza ta ngilegi chue sedu tabadubi chue durwa, nganzin seyegi chue durwa, danzin meba suye chue durwa. So danzin meba suyegi chue di mashegi pardo ani di paru de la kharila zongorela na ngundugi chue de la zongores. Odi sonya.
So what Arya Nagarjuna says, he says, the objective is definitive goodness, but until one can until one can cultivate the causes to attain that state, what one should cultivate are the causes before one can do that, because that is the real practice. But before one can do that, what one cultivates are the causes for a superior or for a higher status or for a higher birth.
So 디지리 지시 nganjin 세비 최디 마셔바 디시 진도 추림도 수비출 구반지스 다간다 nganjin 세베 김젠 다 디니마 체제 밀레기 최디 시에제 최디 시에네 김젠 디이칠 지시 nganjin 세베 최디 마셔기 바도 디시 아니 문도기 최라 아니 구반지스 문도기 최디 냠니 체고레스.
So because to be able to attain that definitive goodness, what it consists in is getting rid of self-grasping. Arya Nagarjuna says, until one can understand how to remove self-grasping, till then one should have kind of faith in cultivating high status or cultivating the causes for a favorable birth.
따이네야 디 냠네 체드베 카도델라 수수기 미조부디 nganjin sebi chedi masheba sheba shela gamne de ngele drubegi chedi shela bezun sheji de worde so di bezun shede wor bezun chede wor.
And if that is what one ends up doing, even though what we might be cultivating are causes for favorable births, while we're doing that, our kind of drive or our objective should be to learn the path to remove self-grasping. So even though we're not doing it directly, because we don't know it, the real kind of driving force or the real desire should be to cultivate a wish to be able to know the ways to remove self-grasping.
니샤지기 나로라 냠랭 개 소소기 지혜 개충부 니차로 냠랭 개체 충부 니차로 찍디 가르래 찍디 아니 nganjin 최디 마셔바 셔바체 대시미자서 주로 마셔바 셔바체라 가주 투두기 수수 릴람 장니 가주 투두기 릴람 표제체 뭐 되는데 마셔바 셔바체 마셔바도 쯩디에디 계란기 니샤직 나로 제 조직디래 제 니버디 가래래라나 다 디마셰기 바도 냠네 마셰바도 디마셰기 바도 링라 제고에기 냠네디 온도기 최를 잠비 냠네치 가리 숭샤바디 소소기 니샤 주직 나로 제도 디니다 가족이 조우들다.
So in one's daily practice there should be two aspects that are simultaneously cultivated. One, which is kind of the main one, is that we should try and find all ways possible to know the four truths that are currently not known to us. And for that, and to that effect, try and use whatever reasoning you've learned. If you haven't, then try and learn how to reason, and then use that reasoning to understand and realize the meaning of the four truths and the 16 aspects. And so to do whatever one can to know what the four truths are should be one indispensable part of one's everyday kind of practice. And the other one should also be that one is not holding off on everything else until that happens, But to make that happen, and also in the meantime to assure that one is not just kind of hoping for that to happen, to cultivate these causes for favorable states also is the second part of the practice. So cultivating these perfections, and therefore doing these in tandem or simultaneously become like the two indispensable aspects of everyday ordinary practice.
디인디 딘시 미다서 주도 셰버세디 셰버소에디 니기 미 조지기 아니 미 샴바디 당기 냠네 원도기 쳬르자면 냠네 당기 냠네 탄다 디니디 인스 단 남시기세 딘시 미다서 주도 셰 딘시 미다서 주도 셰베 참마 깨용디 디니문에 아니 겨랑이 냠네 조디 딘시 미다서 주 탈바기 니레기 쳬디 냠네 조로 바카베로세 원도기 쳬디 샬 원도기 쳬기 냠네디 샬라 차로세.
So right now, that's the same in my case, where my main practices are knowing the four truths and cultivating causes for favorable states. But then when there will be a day when you're doing it like this, where both of them are being cultivated equally, and you come to know what the four truths are, then when you're cultivating the causes to realize and then further one's realization of the four truths, then the cultivation of causes for favorable states, that becomes like a byproduct or something that you do on the side. It doesn't become one central practice anymore. It won't be your central practice. Your central practice from that day on will just be cultivating the four truths.
다 디링로 운동이 최대 냠내 제거도 아니 운동 줍지기 주주 소스.
So until one has realized the four truths and one is able to cultivate them, since we also have to exert in the causes for favorable states, the causes for these favorable states or higher status, the way they've been kind of listed out, they list out 16 of them.
So that 주주도 나로네 주디 맞아 미기 주봉들 다디 맞아 용다시 상미 신이 들어와.
Of these 16, 10 are the normal 10 virtues that we always speak of, which are the opposite of the 10 non-virtues. We all know this.
다디가 쭉 나로네 당부숨디 창미동어디 직체 아니 초상보디 니체 초상보를 때문에 니체 아니 넘버 미세고 숨디 당부숨들.
Then of these 6, the first 3 that Nagarjuna lists is abstaining from intoxicants, correct livelihood, and not harming.
So that 창동에 가야디 다 나는 가서 디 개념이 동바이나레 가리나레 디 상만나로라 디 리기도와 자와시단 창동어디 가야 리기도와.
The first one, which is abstaining from intoxicants, you find that also when you take like the Pratimoksha vows or any vows that you take, you always find this one being mentioned.
The
reason why this has been listed is not because consuming alcohol or an intoxicant itself is non-virtuous. That's not why it's been said.
So that changdi tongbayina ani di kale digi nyamba labche. 아니 창체메 동이 ngol pa gyurugurwa an 창체메 동이 ngol jona ani sheba de thola ro she gorwa da sheba thangna ju cha ro gorwa sheba thangna ju cha ro de ani chöde jiden 강게야 chawa do du yo mare labor de tunju lu din bad thola tang she ge yore tang an ju benjo thola tang ge jik thola de zo de yin ba ji zo da tunju de thola tang she gorwa 이 yin da chö du bie ge 고급 차장 thola tang ge jik de
The reason why intoxicants are mentioned, therefore, is because they have a tendency, they have like an addictive quality. And that addictive quality, when unchecked, it can kind of exaggerate, or it can come to a point where then it becomes all-encompassing or overwhelming. And when that happens, then it has an ability to compromise one's way of living, especially one's clarity, and then it inhibits the ability to be able to make best use of one's state. And because it has this quality, of course, then all the other things that we commonly speak of how it can lead to losing one's money, friends, etc., that's of course there, but that's not the main point. The main point is that it impacts one's ability to make use of the state that we have. And because of that, for someone who wishes to cultivate the Dharma, they are abstaining from intoxicants is mentioned as one of the 16.
다 초와 상보 라이온데 디기 lokchu들 lokor chowa saydirwa 다 lokor chowa deshe mangu yorde ngazo desan mila gogordang chi ngu sue joro da mila pena ngazo scam den damde cheji mi ngu po che gogordang chi do da du sama dendegi tone ngazo ngu sue ji chowa ge de du sama loksoro da denzo ri denzo da cheme yong ge chi gorwa.
And correct livelihood is opposite of wrong livelihood, which there's many explanations, but the main one is gaining wealth or accumulating wealth by misleading others, by doing things that are deceptive and misleading.
And number 7 che. That number 7 de labiondu ngazo migi chu nanglo nesim di leso. Nesim di so semba nanglo ni phage nyoba che de ba che. Number 7 said lu da ngago ni chuba ngu su thön yong. So then
the third one, which is not harming, in the 10 non-virtuous actions, in the 3 that are mental, you have the wish for harm, right? That's a mental one. Here in the list of 16 where you're talking about abstaining from harming, it's not just the mental wish to harm, but here it's referring to the physical and verbal actions of harming other people. So abstaining from harming in the list of 16, when it's separated from the mental non-virtuous action of the wish to harm, refers to the physical and verbal actions of harming others. So to abstain from that. So the 3 to abandon on top of the 10 non-virtuous actions to be abandoned are intoxicants, wrong livelihood, and harming.
druboya sumde karelano kube jimba chebaro yoba cheba ani chambada that chambala sobu gombas.
So the 3 to be cultivated are gube jimbaro, okay? Engaging in generosity, but like respectful generosity.
Kube yoba jimba saidi simjinta longmo wala soba simjin nyamtawa dinzolu kube jimbas chikche.
So kind of engaging in generosity to destitute people, but with an attitude of respect towards them. And then making offerings to objects that are suitable to receive offerings.
아니 지조 나로라 지 미망고라 펜바 야첨부 드빙이 미든조 쳐버려 버려와 어딘조라가 쳐버려 버려 쳐봤어.
So when it says people who are suitable to be made offerings to, it refers to people like one's parents, people who one learns or acquires skills from or acquires benefit from. So people who teach or people who instruct, and then people in society who are engaged in benefit in things that are of benefit to society. These are all things that we also ordinarily consider worthy of offering or making one's offerings to. So then offering things to such people is also one other activity that is considered right here. And then loving kindness, but through loving kindness cultivating the 4 immeasurables. This is the other 3. So the first 3 were things to abandon and abstain from, and the other 3, Nagarjuna writes, are things to cultivate. So these are known as the 16 causes for cultivating favorable states. And so until one has realized the 4 truths and the 16 aspects, cultivating the 16 causes for favorable births is then also a very central practice that
Tadi gyawachimala yiji yobe tone di cheba ina kushuk chombo yore. Kedi gyawachimala yiji mengheji inba ina di judu nga zu chego yore. Tesan zambu jinga tesan nga zu jizo nanglo zambuling nanglo la. Ta di judu nyamne chingi pong de yorwa.
So if you're doing this with the certainty of rebirth, or you're doing it with a favorable birth in mind, then you have to do this But not just that, I mean, these are also just kind of ordinarily considered good things to do. So even without rebirth in mind, this is just basic goodness that one should do.
Did you do the pena that state chick dog charge again? State chick dog, Yulung chick dog, Sharaba chick nalola, Dinalola, Yulung Dinalola, Miss Sama Dinyamin Chigurlana, Dilumban crime zero.
And the fact that it's just good,
Imagine,
is because nowadays it's not happening. So if you imagine a state in a country, a state where everyone acts like this, where everyone, there's going to be no crime.
Police station, the police get some close station.
So there'd be no kind of police or police stations or any kind of controlling bodies. With right now, when you go from one state to another, at the border, oftentimes you're a little bit.
The motor, the accident, Namdakena Nizukara, Dingamdamara, Kumagul levy, Chakwajaga levy, Dingamdaka Dodo.
So one generally, sometimes when you go to certain states, you might, if you're worried because you have an accident, is different. But often what happens is you get worried because you're like, oh God, over here, these people might steal us. There's robbers on this path. This is a dangerous area. This is a dicey place to be in. And so then, yeah.
That didn't state that didn't.
If there's a state where everyone is practicing these 16 causes for higher status, then it's really nice if one could go there. We wouldn't need locks on doors and stuff like that. When we first came to IBD, there was the custom of locking one's door was not there. We never used to lock our doors.
PG door shagere, chura door shagere, tsuying shagere, go to 10 shasha mado, Gonja Gay Lucy Matidi.
When we used to go for debate or class, we would just close the lock without, close the, what do you call it? Latch. The latch without putting a lock on it. Then we started to get into this habit of putting locks onto doors. After something happened.
That in Nekale, that Gonja Yawa Pingaman, Gonja Torgi, an important reading that Lusa Hagachi so here, yeah?
And then because then they started breaking locks, then we started putting safes inside our rooms.
Tadon Kangi Chede, any Rikashi Jolanalo, Luji Choral Leo de Chori. Tarungu Dingashi, Jolanalo, Chalakashi, or the Luji Chorali.
And then sometimes even that wasn't enough. And so people who used to live outside IBD, they would come to debate with a backpack with all of their important things in it.
Reality.
This actually happened.
So the Bakawachima Ijeyanare, Mundu Chudu, Yamnichet, Chisel, the shoe pair.
So whether you believe in rebirth or not, just being able to do these 16 is just helpful generally, even for good living comfortably with each other.
That D Tuba Jumden de la Tsema Gubugone, Dubu Goba Carre Lana, what Dindigita, Tsema de la Madembar, and in Yilegi Churle Zambeta, Dubanyamle Kaya, Yunga Yomare, Dubutobe Yomare, D any Tsema de Guguyore, Guguyoba Indu, that the dig Tsemi Namsha Chi, Chimbadi, and Tuba Sangi Jumdi, Sungra Konalomato, Shimbanala, and the dig Tsema, Chinjimolo, Sheba, the Tungumidus, D Tuba Jumden de la Tsema to Goba Teen, Cherta.
So because to be able to practice the teachings of the Buddha without pramana, it's not possible. And because then having inference becomes fundamental to be able to cultivate the teachings of the Buddha, the reason for praising the Buddha is because when one looks at teachings that can be verified through valid cognition, it is only from his teachings, from the teachings of the Buddha, that I find such a presentation that is valid, can be validly ascertained. This is why Acharya Dignaga has written his praise to the Buddha by how he came to be infallible, by how he came to be valid, pramana. Then how do his teachings show what inferential pramana is?
Di Jowa Tongchero, men of Mijun Tiniji, Dani Java Denu, Drubje Dinzi Cabani, Dinchir Tian Seva Shies.
Because inference is not negated, and also because we see him giving many syllogisms such as, whatever has the slightest nature of arising, all are subject to cessation. A reason characterized by concomitance is a support of inference. Also, because it teaches a probandum that pervades the reason, these are clearly spoken.
다 도과질랑제 좀디디기 숭람 나로라 제바체마 세인데 타니 튀응미도 안 제바체마 칸디 템버레스.
So the doubt here is, if you're insisting on the centrality of inference, the teachings of the Buddha don't have any inference, or they don't teach inference. How is this possible?
다 딜렌들 레인이 송셰 게디 좀디디기 제바체마 세지 킬링이 메나 안 제바체마 체마들 아니 무슨마도 제바체마 요마레스 제바체마 고릭발라 상기 숭람 나라 제바체마 고고 슝칸야 요마레스.
So there's two reasons that are being given. The first is the first line, which says, were the Buddha not to agree with inference being valid, and were he to deem only direct perception to be valid, he would have had to address this point and negate inference being valid, but he doesn't. In none of his teachings do you find the Buddha negating inference being valid.
다양 제바체마 요마레스 가과 교민도 제바체마 요레스 drubi민도 완 dru메나 요바 랍투고 마르와슬라나.
So then sure, fine, maybe he didn't negate it, but that's definitely not sufficient to say he accepts it, or that he teaches it, or uses it. And so then how can you say that the Buddha accepts inference just because he doesn't refute it?
So that 제바체마 세제 딘데기 타니 세우게 매바이나야 제바체마 슈글 땡기요레 시기요레 셰단디 칸데르스나 제바체마기 땡 따양다 시요레스.
And so even though in the sutras you don't find explicit mention of the term inference, what you do find is explanations of what gives rise to inference, which are valid reasons or valid syllogisms.
간데송 요레스도 돌레 강중세계의 다니제 대탐진의 가비 추진이노스.
And so where do you see this? Where in the sutras the Buddha says, whatever has the slightest nature of arising, all are subject to cessation.
시소 넘버 2말 제바티 땡 따양다기 조와송과 통위시르스.
And therefore, reasons that are characterized by being the property of the subject, no, these are supports of inference. These reasons are the support of inference. And these reasons such as this have been spoken of in the sutras.
손자다 강중세계의 다니제 대탐제 가비 추진이 세도 아니 강계의 다니이 대탐제 가비 추진레스 라비윤디 강체바이나 미다바이 비첩세게 어디 땡기요.
So where it says whatever has the slightest nature of arising, all are subject to cessation, is saying whatever arises has to cease, which is the same thing as saying whatever is produced has to be impermanent. It's the relation between these two.
디기 랑싱이 따양다.
So this is a correct nature sign.
다나 신기 좀는데기 도 나로라 두월라네 메시도 추자라네 추제도 장주선보로 네기 리니 체마탈레 시에스 대다양다 기텐시.
Then there's another verse in the sutras where the Buddha says, from smoke, fire, from those water birds' water, the realizations of bodhisattvas can be inferred through their physical signs. And so he gives another explanation of how correct nature effect signs work.
다나싱이 좀된데기 도 나로라 ngadandobe 강사기 추신기 강사기 가서 추미스니 냠바 규다레세 디기 마미 비틴시.
And then again in another sutra the Buddha says, only me and beings like me can judge, can say what others are. Anyone else who does that has, like there is room for their downfall. And so he speaks of non-observation signs.
손자 따양다 세나 가리레스나 초주당 두제셔다 메나미 중에 신이진게 따니 제바기 땡연나스 제바기 땡이 따양다 세디 데레 디인디다 탄다 도디기 두제치기 따라 캬방무수 땡베치 슈기 제바테야 세와셰바이노스.
And so because reasons or correct reasons that are characterized by being a property of the subject and being a reason that is concomitant with the predicate of the probandum, such reasons are a support of inference. Because these sutras explicitly teach a predicate of the probandum that pervades the reason, they implicitly also speak of inference.
Then
there's another sutra where the Buddha says, whatever arises through causes does not arise, it does not have the nature of arising.
딜라도다 랑싱기 깨와메데 규jel란 때니 깨웨이지스 덴디기 덴세기 딱딱 송리요래.
And so this one is giving dependent arising as a reason to prove that things are not inherent, which is things do not arise inherently because they arise through causes. So even there the Buddha has given a syllogism.
딘디다 좀데디 도나로 미다바 주비 덴시니 체지 다메 참모 동유 주비 덴시 덴데버도 도나로 송샤버도와.
And so from all the way from impermanence all the way to selflessness and emptiness, in the sutras you find like many reasons that the Buddha enumerates to prove all of these things.
디인데 제소 빠빠 마도치 중세계에 다니지 칸데 탐지 가주지 시소 넘버 2만이 디조와 통치로 세다 넘버 2마세디 와든데기 딘시괴샤바 빼먹고 통해요레스.
Which is why it says, and because we see him giving many syllogisms such as whatever has the slightest nature of arising are all subject to cessation, where he's giving a reason characterized by concomitance, this is a support for inference. And also because they teach a probandam that pervades the reason, the Buddha has clearly spoken of inference.
다 제바기 땡디 수숨들에 수숨기 나니 쪼디 제첩들에.
And so because
쪼디 제첩 독점이들에.
and because the base or like what inference relies on are reasons, and amongst reasons the main component of what makes a valid reason is the forward and counter pervasion.
디인데 매너 미중 친이제 따니 제바 땡이노 세디체 두지 딘지 캬니 땡치르스.
Which is why here Acharya Dharmakirti is writing a reason characterized by concomitance. Concomitance here means that it always follows the predicate. Such a reason is a support for inference, and also because the sutras teach a probandam that pervades the reason, and here probandam is another way of talking about the predicate of the probandam. These are clearly spoken.
디인데 반대초라게 남들 리우 당보 나로라 아니 제바 미다바 주비 딘시 코트 셰윤데 제메다기 남샤스 코트 마 셰윤데 조 제바도 미다니 버루라 메나미 중에 대와 친이 세 디강리 딱한테 지단에 딘시 양다 사이드 다 양다 사이드 조 메나미 중에 대와 고야지 메나미 중에 대와 텔라 숨도 니수 장예바 디기 토네 아니 딘시 텔라 딱한테 메나미 중에 대와 텔라 니수 예베 디 차네 고 랑싱이 딘지지다 아니 대다양다기 딘지지 고 니수 용돼야지 다 두제체라 가과도 두바기 개바디기 토네 아니 가과기 토네 마미 딘지두스레 돼야지 다 다양들 숨 용단태야 다춘이기 대화기 띵니 용돼야지 소다 리우탕보가 숨고라다.
And in the first chapter, Acharya Dharmakirti, what he's primarily teaching is that whenever you have a reason, the reason has to be concomitant. Concomitant is another way of talking about it has to always follow from the predicate, which means if the predicate were not there, the reason would not come about. And because such kind of relations are divided into two, which are same entity or causal, is why then you have a division into correct effect signs and correct nature signs. And then if the predicate is a positive phenomenon or a negative phenomenon, or you're trying to prove the existence of something or the absence of something, that is going to divide it into whether it is a a positive sign or a negative sign, all of which revolve around the fact that something has to be related to something else, or the reason has to be related to the predicate for you to be able to generate inference. That's why Acharya Dharmakirti, on the backbone of the predicate being, the reason being related to the predicate, divides correct signs into these three.
대다르스 루중도 루도니 덤바 샤죠도 좋아 튀니기 옹버도베 된라 세마 주바나 대송비 룽기 땜바남 타르드남기 중무소 녀바니에데 대니 송베 랑도르게 탐젤라 솜니메바 도는 수유신도 제발레 좋아 토비.
In this way, if the teacher Shakyamuni Buddha is established to be infallible for those who wish for liberation, his teachings can be ascertained to be the entrance for those who wish for liberation. In this way, by correctly following all aspects that have been taught in the teachings without having any more doubt, liberation will be attained.
Oh yeah. 다 좀된데 저와 되니 용어버드비 틀라 밀려가 체마드비 수시베 된주 체마드비 리우이 뒤데 디니 리수마치비 신년남기 샵드주 랑바 르룩수바 리메기시 디주 균메기스 편당가베 세종아다 질론이동 이상아 다워드비 세주라 랑샤 노링 뜻이 예주도 조거 기소 디진제베 땜버는 보지 초군도 개버 체뉴브 교식스.
This condensed presentation of the Shastra, the Pramana chapter that perfectly teaches how the Buddha is a non-misleading guide for those who wish to attain liberation. I've changed it a little bit here. Having taken the dust of the feet of spiritual guides of different traditions to the crown of my head, was completed on the 15th day of the 5th Tibetan month, or the 10th of July 2025, by an alumnus of the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics, Rime Geshe Tenzin Gyurme, at his residence Tashi Yakhil in Norbulinka. May this have the ability to spread the precious teachings of the victorious ones in all directions. So it's finished now.
Tapaje di dangbuche nibache sumbashi. Tangi semanamdi liuniba tie di paje di tengshi badrish.
This is the 4th time that I wrote this text.
Lameda. Tie di.
Palet, yeah, 4th time I taught this text.
Dingal shaba sum gyasa da di chaba shaba shiba dokdi.
I've done it thrice before, this is the 4th time.
Hola so.